that I've been on to write my dissertation and to come up with my history and my findings. I want to add in some theoretical perspectives, clinical implications, and I'm going to be relying quite heavily on a new publication which came out in January this year, written by Christina Szylinski, who is a Jungian analyst, and her book covers the question of an adult replacement child coming into being from a Jungian perspective. She herself is a replacement child also, in a very similar way to me, as I will demonstrate in a minute. And I've been in touch with her since August 2018, before I completed my dissertation. And I want to pay tribute to the help that I've had from Christina. This is her book, and I strongly recommend it as almost a Bible on this particular topic. She doesn't call it pathology, she calls it a syndrome, a collection of symptoms that those of us who come up with this particular history demonstrate. And I shall be talking to that in due course. So what is meant by a replacement child? What does it mean to be, and here we have a list which I've gleaned from Christina's book that takes us through the different ways that we may become a replacement child depending on our history. So the first one is conceived or born to replace a child or other member of the family who has died. Who is born shortly after a death, stillbirth, miscarriage, or abortion. And this she calls a subsequent child. Is born as a surviving twin or multiple. Is born to replace a sibling or other member of the family later on due to death or disability. In the context of the adoption of a child, replacing or replaced by a conceived child. And who is assigned the role to replace a missing person or self-identified with such a role. Now, just to add some statistics in there, 1 in 4 pregnancies in this country, 1 in 4 end in miscarriage. 1 out of 225 babies every year are stillborn. 2,000 babies die perinatally. And a half, I've no idea how they arrived at these statistics, but a half of all twins conceived, one fetus dies. So just the sheer statistical context of this suggests that we're likely to come up against, have such an adult come into our cohort of clients. And the other way that it comes in, and I believe it came into my cohort of clients, small though it is that you may get a parent who has adopted a child, or who is planning a new pregnancy, or some other way when mourning for a previous loss has not yet to be achieved. And that's another way in which, a very important way, because that actually prevents the syndrome going forward. So those are 2 different ways that it becomes important in our work. Now, I'm not all of those things. Christina isn't all of those things either. I'm a child who was born after the miscarriage of my mother. I'm a subsequent child. And I'd like to say a little bit about my mother here. My mother was born in 1905, and she had her first pregnancy when she was 36 years old. And we're talking about something that happened in the middle of the 1939-45 war, the Second World War. So her first pregnancy was then, and not only that, but also she had had trouble conceiving. She was married in 1939, just before the war began, and she was under a consultant to help her conceive in order to conceive that first child. I'm not sure what they did then for that help, but I know that was indeed the case. And around her, of course, men were dying. And the message really from the First World War too was to be stoic, not to mourn, to have another child, to get on with life. And so there's a particular history that belongs to a mother and her inability to fully complete the mourning that she needs to do before she contemplates having another child. And here is a picture that I've chosen to represent a mourning mother and all that that entails. And I really can't emphasize enough that the key to this is the mourning process that the person replacing manages to do, which is why I want to emphasize the role not only of recognizing a replacement child, but also supporting grieving in our clients. Now, how does it come about that this replacement happens? Well, Volkan, in his work, has suggested that there is a deposited representation of the dead child from the mother to the newborn. And she does this to assimilate and thus keep alive that dead child's representation. And this happens because there's a permeability between the psychic boundaries of the very young child and his mother. This picture, I showed it to Tree beforehand, and to her it represented hope, but to me it represents death. And of course, I was born into a womb where a child had not long since died. I'm not quite sure of the exact dates. The dates were never given, and I didn't at the time ask. My mother died in 1987. My son said to me, not so very long ago, and before he knew about my dissertation, before I'd done that work, "You always seem to me to be sad, Mummy." And I think that's symptomatic, not just of me, but of other such children. And I want to turn to a series of pictures. Now, this is a picture which I see as a child kind of in a hole, and a mother who doesn't look alive behind it. Look at the hand, look at the difference in colour with the face. So the child is alive and the mother doesn't somehow seem to be so alive. And this is a painting by Egon Schiele. Now, to say something about Egon Schiele, he was born in 1890. His mother had married somebody. She was 17 when she married. She married an older man who had syphilis. And before he was born, his mother had three miscarriages. And we might wonder whether he experienced his mother as a dead mother, a mourning mother, a mother involved with death. And there's an article which you can download from the internet by Gorgashon. The details are at the bottom. And she has analysed the series of pictures, of which this is one, in the light of his particular history. She does not, in fact, suggest that he was a replacement child, but some of the themes would seem to be common. And she also looks at the effect of syphilis on him, which of course is a separate issue. His pictures carry some of the characteristic bodily representations of congenital syphilis, and we don't know whether he painted them in or whether he actually did have them, and she talks about this in her article. But to come back to the question of the replacement child, Schilinski suggests that the replacement child experiences the mother as dead. It's interesting to note, he only lived till he was 28 years old, Egon Schiele, and he died in the pandemic in 1918. So we have a sort of connection with him here today as we live through the pandemic that we have. And I've chosen this picture to represent a mother's attunement to her baby, because that's what's missing. The mother is attuned not to the child in front of her and all of that child's personality, potential, but rather to the baby that she's lost. And in my case, the baby who was lost was a boy baby, and I was a girl. So my mother, how can I put it, saw me as that replacement for her boy baby. Now, there are benefits to that I can smile about. I can use an electric drill. I can hammer in a nail. I have a background in physics and mathematics, sort of things that might be more associated, certainly in my generation, with a male than a female. And I've now learned to see those as strengths and as silver lining. And we'll come back to that later at the end of this presentation, when I show you how I've combined them in a very concrete way. But nonetheless, that mirroring, that early mirroring is missing. And this is a picture of the 10 months old me and my mother in August 1943. And I experienced my mother as very self-centered, very preoccupied with self, very damaged, needing to be looked after. She had to have exactly what she needed for her birthday, sort of like at the eye of a camel's needle. What do I mean? The eye of a needle and a camel. If I bought her flowers, they had to be pink tulips and none other. So the damage to her of the loss is palpable in the way I perceived her, and we shall come back to that later too. And this is another picture of me, in this case, aged 18 months in April 1944. And I've picked this picture because it looks quite an alone child, and that is really how I experience myself. And Christina says that is a characteristic that she's noticed. And she wrote her thesis in 2000, completed her thesis, I think, 2009, if I've got that accurately, and has had a considerable number of clients who have come to her suspecting that they were replacement children. So in her book, you'll find a number of case studies which highlight different ways in which children, adults have learned as children to respond to their history in this particular regard. This is a picture that I constructed in therapy, my last but one therapy, Jungian therapy in this case, of me before I was born, and there I am in my mother's pregnant body, and me afterwards, where I had to hold my mother psychically. That's how I experienced it practically later, but we kind of imagined, and I sensed the resonance when my therapist suggested that I had had to hold my mother psychically. And this takes us back to that permeability between the small newborn and the mother, and the possibility of that internal representation to keep her baby alive. don't know if I can go back. I want to go back because I want to stay with this for a moment. Now, Christina turned to Jung, and you will know, of course, from Tree that I chose to study as a humanistic and integral therapist. And that's reflected in my history too. I didn't turn to Jung for my insights. I turned first to Winnicott, in fact, probably around late 1980s, all the way through till the 90s. I turned to Winnicott for insights. And there were so many of his concepts that truly spoke to me. The false self, the falling forever, the lack of holding. These all had significant resonance for me. And impingements too. My goodness me, impingements. So my first therapist, whom I only worked with for 6 months when I was finishing a postgraduate degree at London University, was in 1986. And one of the shocks I had, I came into the counselling at the university voluntarily because I was experiencing difficulties in my relationship at that time. And I expected to get counselling support and was told immediately that I needed therapeutic help and not counselling. And that terrified the living daylights out of me. It felt as though I had, it gave me a sense of being pathologized almost. That was certainly an impingement and difficult for me to swallow. And the impingements went on. I started my next and longer Freudian psychotherapy in 1987. And the next slide shows one by one some of the things that I experienced as impingements. Nobody told me ever that I was a replacement child, interestingly, and I'm not sure I could have handled it anyway. It was really important for me to discover, and the things I was told didn't help. So the very first therapist in 1986 told me that I was very angry with my mother, and my journey was to find that anger. And I found it difficult to believe. I mean, at that time, I was there to take care of my mother. I was still more or less enthralled to her. And that for me, I just couldn't make sense of. And then in 1987, quite early on in that Freudian therapy, my therapist said to me, while being undoubtedly female, one of your parents, probably your father, wanted you to be a boy. Another, for me, impingement. I couldn't digest it. I found it terrifying. I mean, what was he noticing in me? Did I walk in some kind of strident way? Were my clothes showing something? I had no knowledge of any male. I did know that I'd done applied physics as a study. I did know that I could do things that my sister couldn't do. Nonetheless, I found it very frightening. It wasn't who I sensed myself to be at core. Interestingly, I didn't say, yes, it was my father. I said back to him immediately, it wasn't my father. And I noticed my voice catching here. It was my mother. My father bought me dolls. My mother bought ladders and practical things that I could do things with. Was important to her. I learned to drive competently, all sorts of things like that. So the signals were there. And at some level, I must have known that it was she who wanted to be, or I wouldn't have been able to answer that quite so quickly. I just want to touch on something. If the replacement child as adult, but the replacement is for another girl for girl or boy for boy, it's more difficult to tell. And Christina covers that too. The symptoms that I demonstrate aren't just symptoms of being a replacement child. They're symptoms of a not good enough mothering. They're symptoms of a deprived child. And it's the history that really gives the clue. We'll come back to that later. But certainly it's more difficult to spot, do I have a replacement child, if the replacement is the same as the loss. One of my members of my extended family, and I have her permission to share this with you, when she heard what I'd written about for my dissertation, she opened up and said she thought that that might apply to her. In fact, she was asking me so many questions that I said to her, "What's this about? Why are you so interested?" And it turns out that she suspects that she is a replacement child because there was she lost her aunt. She didn't lose her aunt. Her mother's younger sister died age 20, and she suspected that she carried many of the characteristics of, acted like her, spoke like her, and she may want to take that further or not. We don't know. And then another impingement. Now, this was a therapist that asked to see me. It was my then partner who went to see her with the possibility of his working with her. And she refused to work with him as it happened, but she said, "I want to meet with your partner, me." And she said, "I want to tell you that you are still carrying around a broken male." I didn't, again, what on earth does that mean? I hadn't a clue. It really had to be my journey. And I don't know how typical that is of replacement children, but that's how it was for me. When I was researching the replacement child, I found this quote that I hadn't come across before. Winnicott suggests that a baby gets around the problem of being deprived, of not having good enough early experience, by thinking, which results in an uneasy intelligence, where intelligence is hiding a degree of deprivation. And that, for me, that resonates with me. So I suggest to you that my false self looks confident, looked, self-sufficient, invincible even. And again, those are characteristics that Christina has noted in her larger cohort, invincibility. And underneath, like the proverbial swan, I'm paddling like mad to hold myself together sometimes. And that's not just to do with me, as we well know, but certainly it's true of the replacement child who hasn't had adequate mirroring. And I'm turning now to two pieces from Rodman's biography of Winnicott. I've got it here. This my copy looks like. And he quotes that famous poem of Winnicott's: "Once stretched out on her lap, as now on a dead tree, I learned to make her smile, to stem her tears, to undo her guilt, to cure her inward death. To enliven her was my living." Now, if you know that poem, you will know that the stretched out on a dead tree, it's normally it has Christian overtones, the crucifixion and other aspects, but it's very clear that it's also about Winnicott himself, and that he experienced, Rodman suggests, his mother as depressed. He learned to make her smile, to stem her tears, to undo her guilt, to cure her inward death. And that certainly resonates with me. To enliven her was her living. My mother insisted that I phone her even after she was dead every Sunday at 10 o'clock, and she would pour out, and she couldn't hear anything that I was saying, pouring out her depression and her reaction to whatever was going on that had triggered it that particular week. And one significant thing in my journey was to say, I'm not going to phone you anymore. I will write to you once a week, as long as I can go on doing that with good energy. And that's what I did. And that was a very important milestone in my journey. Now, there's another reason why Winnicott speaks to me, I think, apart from the resonance of his various concepts. And Rodman covers this in his biography too. He argues that there's plenty of evidence that Winnicott himself, not that he was a replacement child, but that his mother wanted him to be a girl. And this is what he says about it. Winnicott realized, and he realized it through working with a particular client who had the same phenomenon, had been seen by his mother as a girl, and that he had been dealing with this all his life without having been able to identify it as such. So at this point in my life, I thought that what I was dealing with was being wanted as the opposite gender, not that there was more to it than that, as later came out. And it seemed interesting, at the very least, that Winnicott too had that particular aspect, as Rodman suggests. So what do these look like, these things? And this comes from Christina's book too. So we would note existential insecurity. I'll come back to that shortly. Disturbed self-esteem. After all, this child isn't wanted for themselves, they're wanted to represent another by a key person, their mother, or another parent or relative. There's relational disturbance and insecurity. There's difficulties with identity. Who am I? Again, not surprisingly. There's guilt. Let's have a look at why. He or she may feel responsible for the loss or death. May feel guilty over the rage at never being good enough. I certainly hit up against that preparing this presentation. That should say never being, let me start again, over being inauthentic, not at one with herself, in my case. Due to being the wrong gender as well as the wrong child. Over being alive when another or others have died. And these are the sort of questions we might ask. Was there a previous child before birth? Was a child conceived with medical assistance where fetuses were lost? Have family members perished? Was there an earlier abortion? Was there a lost twin? Remember that half of all twins are lost. Sometimes surely can't be known about. The nearest I got to being told that I was a replacement child was that my most recent therapist, who was with me through the training, suggested I might be a lost twin, but of course I knew that wasn't, well, I didn't think it was the case. Is there a disabled child in the family? So that the able child carries something for the disabled child and the family, the whole child. Was this child adopted to replace a lost child? Has a naturally conceived child replaced an adopted one? So what do? We watch for longer birth gaps between births. A person's name may give a clue. So I have the name Patricia, and I was called Pat, which can be male or female. And then more seriously in some ways, Look for backgrounds which involve a refugee history, war, genocide, persecution, famine. It occurs to me, I'm saying this to Judy in particular, in her leadership of Trauma Foundation Southwest, which works with traumatized refugees, that we're likely to come up against replacement children there. Back to identity. So one of the ways in which my insecurity shows is that if I lose something, I'm in blind terror, particular things. One of the things I could be triggered into blind terror would be my handbag. And my last therapist, Helen Fry, invited me one session to tip out my handbag and see what was there. My passport, some money, my phone, which contains all my contacts, all my people, credit cards, bus passes. Notice there's no lipstick or anything like that. They're all things that enable me to function as me. Passport perhaps critically. And another signal, in my first degree, I took a psychology seminar, and we studied, it had not long since been published, I think, The Divided Self by R.D. Laing, which looks at schizophrenia. And he writes about ontological insecurity. I couldn't get a handle on what that meant. It was like I couldn't let it in. However, what I did let in and frightened me was his description of his clients who found it difficult to be seen and terrifying not to be seen. And I knew that covered me too. I was frightened of being seen because that meant annihilation. And I was frightened of not being seen because that meant I didn't exist in another way. So caught between those two without resolution. Now, my journey was enlightened by events that happened through my cats. This is my cat, Mehitabel. And this was, as you will see on the screen, it says 1989. In 1989, I was living in a converted barn, and the conversion wasn't done very well. And I had builders in to put it right. And there were openings because of the work they were doing into the lining between the 16th century outer and the modern inner. And I went on holiday, and my daughter came in and was looking after Mehitabel and her brother Archie. And she got into the wall and died. And I went into the most enormous grief. And my sense was that I was grieving not just for her, but for all the children and all the mothers who had been lost over centuries. And I found a cemetery, a pet cemetery, through which her remains could be held. That was really important, to give her a ritual. And this is Macbeth. Now, Macbeth is slightly different from Mehitabel in the sense that I bred him. So he was closer to me. I put my Siamese queen to stud and there when she gave birth. And he's a blue point. And so his muzzle is dark and his eyes are blue, like all Siamese cats. Now he died. I had a bungalow in Ireland and I would take my cats over. And Archie, that's Mehitabel's brother, litter brother, greeted me at the gate after collecting visitors from the ferry, howling, and took me to Macbeth's dead body. And his body was torn, there was no stomach left, but otherwise he was intact. And that replicated exactly the description of my mother's dead baby when he was born. dark-haired, blue-eyed boy as Macbeth, with his stomach torn, otherwise perfectly formed. And again, I went into grief, this time for this baby, not babies in general, or lost children, or lost people, but babies but this baby boy in particular. And he's buried in my garden in Ireland. Now, this is the standing stone erected in the church in Dunblane in 1996 to commemorate the lost lives of the 15 children who were slaughtered there. Now, you might expect that I identified with the children who were slaughtered, but I didn't. I was furious with the children who were slaughtered. And I felt terribly guilty about being furious very angry with the children who were slaughtered. Unfortunately, I had a therapist at the time and I took it to her, and I was about to go on a training, which I predicted, and indeed turned out to be the case, would change the direction of my life. And I was terrified that the death of these children would stop me going. It isn't logical, it isn't rational. But my therapist fortunately had the wit to see the symbolism. And she said, well, of course, a dead baby, a child who died, affected all of your life, didn't he? So why wouldn't you be angry when a child dies, at a child who died? Now, I said earlier that I turned to a variety of different therapies, and during the course of the training, I undertook all sorts of things that the college in their wisdom have days where people come and present. This, in fact, didn't take place at the college, but I learnt about it through the college. And I took part in building a constellation of my family in the context of systemic family therapy. And as you see here, it says, in systemic family therapy, we're interested in discovering people's entanglement in the fates of previous members of their family. This is something that comes to light in a family constellation. When it's out in the open, they can find a resolution of the entanglement more easily. This is from Hellinger's book. And indeed, that's what happened. The therapist who helped me construct the constellation said, the key to your situation is that dead baby boy. This was a sketch I did in response to an exercise we did in class where I was outside of my mother and a baby. I had thought at the time it was my sister, but I now wonder whether that was indeed the case. And in this drawing at the same session, I was outside a male and female couple. And the day that I next went to was in something called attachment-focused EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprogramming, which was originally established to support Vietnam soldiers returning with post-traumatic stress disorder. And it involves, as it says, eye movement with watching a finger moving, though there are other ways of doing it. The attachment focus, I've done some EMDR as EMDR, and attachment focus is what it says it is, informed by attachment. And I was the guinea pig that day, and the person running it, the EMDR, attachment focused EMDR therapist, asked me to choose a situation, and I did, and went into something very deep where I murdered this couple. both of them. Shocking to me and crying at the same time. But I still didn't have all the pieces. And I took the stuckness that I felt in relation to my dissertation to back to BCPC. And I think Claire is here today, Claire Crocker, and I owe tribute to her because she said in that session where I put up this particular slide, could it be, Pat, that the couple that you're excluded from is your mother and her dead baby? And of course, there was the resonance. That was the couple from which I was excluded. And then again, synchronistically, after that session, I searched Google Books against two keywords, loss and narcissistic trauma. And up came this quotation. In some cases, the loss of a baby is experienced as a catastrophic narcissistic trauma. And further, a desperate attempt to ward off primitive anxieties of psychic disintegration, and overwhelming depression in the mother results in the creation of a projection onto the next child born, the successive child. Excuse me, I want to go back there. And we're coming to the end of my presentation because I want to leave time for questions, not having heard any come up, Tree. So I finally had the pieces I needed, that it wasn't just that my mother wanted me to be a boy, but she also wanted me to take on the grief that she couldn't express, and which certainly as a child I wouldn't have had the psychic capacity to deal with, and also some of her, I suppose, dreams for that child too. So what have I done? Well, I talked about this with my dissertation supervisor. I didn't really understand why, but I knew that my next big project after the dissertation was to bring together, I was living in one bedroomed flat at the time, and I owned the adjacent flat, a single building with divided into two flats, actually built on an 1860 stables and converted in the 1950s. And I owned both of them. And I decided I wanted to turn them into a single dwelling. And indeed, I've done that. I'm living in it now. I'm sitting in the office that this has created as I speak to you. And I want to show you what it looks like. So, beg your pardon, that's come up again when I went back. This is what the two flats looked like before the conversion. I don't know whether you can see there's two flats. The two cars belong to two different occupants, one upstairs, one downstairs. And also the whole of the front garden was tarmac and pretty barren at the time. It took me 18 months to raise the funds. And it's taken 8 months of building work to convert it. And that's what it looks like now. The sense of peace and holding that I have, because I would say that I brought together the two parts of me, the part that my mother wanted me to be, from which I have benefits, and the part I am, which I express through my client work, which I express through needlework and all kinds of design things that I do. Just to go back to Christina for a minute, she suggests that there are 3 ways of getting around the problem of being a replacement child. One is to go mad. My sister is a replacement child too, I've worked out, but for a different member of my family. She carries the names of 2 members of my father's family, and she did indeed go mad. You can become creative, and I'm going to show you a sculpture by artist Caroline Mackenzie, a replacement child, and she has learned to express and also process through her art, or become a psychotherapist or analyst. So I've got 2 out of 3, so I'm lucky. And this is my favourite sculpture of Caroline Mackenzie's, the warrior craftswoman, she calls it, which I like very much.